In this video, as a follow-up to the last video of what is critical reading, I want to actually give two examples or two run-throughs of what a critical reading might look like. Now, I'm not using SAT passages. In fact, one of the examples I'm going to use would probably never appear on the SAT. But what I want to at least show you is what the process of critical reading would look like if we were just doing this for our own purposes, if we weren't doing this for the SAT. Now, again, the SAT is going to be a much more constricted activity in that you're going to have certain questions you have to answer, whereas this activity is obviously much more open and free. But what this will at least show you is what that process looks like. And of course, we're going to use critical reading everywhere in our lives. You're going to have to use it in college. You're going to have to use it, or you should use it, when doing other important things in your life related to politics or your own healthcare or what have you. Going out to buy a car might require some critical reading or critical thinking at the very least. So this activity will show you kind of what this process looks like, what the process of critical reading looks like, and how we work through any kind of text. So the first text we're going to start with is a nonfiction passage from Michael Shermer's Why People Believe Weird Things. So how this is going to work is I'm going to read through this, and as I go, I'm going to give kind of a running commentary on the things I notice, what the text is trying to say, or at least what I think it's trying to say, and also some moments that you see opportunities for SAT-style questions. So where, if the test makers were using this passage, where they would ask questions with that kind of SAT flair and SAT flavor. So let's get started. In the paranormal world, coincidences are often seen as deeply significant. Synchronicity is invoked, as if some mysterious force were at work behind the scenes. So notice we begin by discussing, first we have this reference to in the paranormal world. So we have the author Shermer here is giving us an indication as to who he's arguing against. And he says that coincidences are seen as significant. Synchronicity is invoked. So in other words, people see coincidence and they see, well, coincidence, that could never have happened by chance, so it's got to mean something. There's got to be some kind of mysterious force that makes this coincidence happen. So maybe one actually SAT question could have been, what is this synchronicity? What does synchronicity mean? As a vocab and context question, or maybe just as a regular question. Moving on. But I see synchronicity as nothing more than a type of contingency. Note here, as we'll talk about in later videos, whenever the author injects himself or herself into the piece, as Shermer does here, specifically by using the pronoun I, it's a moment where we really want to pay attention because this is where the author is staking his claim. And notice this is going to contrast to what he has set up as kind of the common understanding before. I see synchronicity as nothing more than a type of contingency, a conjuncture of two or more events without apparent design. When the connection is made in a manner that seems impossible according to our intuition of the laws of probability, we have a tendency to think something mysterious is at work. So what's going on here? Well, first Shermer sets up this idea of people see coincidence, they see meaning there. And Shermer says, well, I don't see meaning there at all. I see it's just the fact that it's random. And in fact, we can explain this randomness through the laws of probability. So now we can see as potentially one kind of SAT question would be, what is Shermer's argument here? How is he staking himself against this group of people who believe in the paranormal? And how is he contrasting his belief with the belief of his opponents? Moving on to the next part. But most people will have a very poor understanding of the laws of probability. Notice we have a transition sentence here, so in terms of structure, this nicely is a good lead-in from the previous paragraph where we start with laws of probability and then we go right into this new discussion of what he means by laws of probability and how people might misinterpret those laws. A gambler will win 6 in a row and then think he is either on a hot streak or due to lose. 2 people in a room of 30 people discover that they have the same birthday and conclude that something mysterious is at work. You go to the phone to call your friend Bob. The phone rings and it is Bob. You think, wow, what are the chances? This could not have been a mere coincidence. Maybe Bob and I are communicating telepathically. In fact, such coincidences... Okay, so what is going on here? Well, notice he's kind of set up, here is how people get probability wrong, and then gives examples. The SAT likes to highlight the points where the author gives examples. So these might be examples to support some general theory or general hypothesis, right? You can imagine this could be one of those kind of SAT questions where they say the examples and lines such and such serve to what? And maybe the answer here would be illustrate a theory or something like that. Okay, moving on. In fact, such coincidences are not coincidences under the rules of probability. So here again, this language, in fact, this kind of transition language, hints to us or indicates to us that we have the author inserting himself here. And now he's going to tell us what his interpretation of what these coincidences mean. And he says that they are not coincidences at all if you look at them probabilistically. The gambler has predicted both possible outcomes, a fairly safe bet. The probability that two people in a room of 30 people will have the same birthday is 0.71. And you have forgotten how many times Bob did not call you under such circumstances, or someone else called, or Bob called, but you are not thinking of him, and so on. So now notice in these paragraphs we get Schirmer's explanation. What Schirmer believes is the true understanding of what those things mean, or in this case, don't mean at all. Next, as the behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner proved in the laboratory, the human mind seeks relationships between events and often finds them even when they are not present. Slot machines are based on Skinnerian principles of intermittent reinforcement. The dumb human, like the dumb rat, only needs an occasional payoff to keep pulling the handle. The mind will do the rest. Okay, so he finishes up by citing an authority, which is something that the SAT sometimes asks about what does it mean to cite an authority. And clearly here it's trying to bolster his position by bringing up this guy B.F. Skinner, a very famous behavioral psychologist, and trying to use him to show, well, this is evidence, or at least more corroborating information as to why my interpretation of coincidence is the correct one. Okay, so that was this nonfiction passage. A few notes about it generally. I mean, one thing to start off, we could talk about a passage like this for an hour, right? And that is one of the things about critical reading that is important to realize. Critical reading is something that doesn't end. We don't get to a final interpretation. We don't get to a moment where, oh, we're done. We figured out the whole thing. There's nothing more to say. There's always more to say about a text. So obviously we're going to not say everything we possibly can about this text here, but I will just mention a few things the SAT might point out. First, a tone or attitude question. What is the author's tone? What is his attitude towards these issues? I think it comes off clear from this section, at least, that his attitude towards those who believe in the paranormal, or at least those who believe in coincidence as something truly meaningful in some kind of mysterious way, I think his tone or attitude, I should say, to that is skeptical, right? And maybe in some sense, a little condescending, right? We get this idea at the end, the dumb human. We can kind of use that to stand in as the person who doesn't understand the laws of probability. He or she is like the dumb rat, nothing more than an animal. In any event, that might be something the SAT might pull out. And there's a lot more. So, for instance, there's reference to the gambler and then later to the slot machine. It's an interesting moment where we see this connection between random chance and the meaning we put on random chance, and then how that might relate to, say, the later example of Bob and what Bob, or you calling your friend Bob, or sorry, you thinking about your friend Bob just at the moment as he calls, and what does that mean? So this passage, as you can see, works to define the argument against. Then Schirmer comes in and gives his own example, gives his own argument as to why he thinks that interpretation is incorrect. He gives examples, he reframes those examples, and then concludes by citing an authority. So that overall is a good reading of that text, what it's trying to do, and you can imagine the SAT could ask a lot more questions about that. Let's move on to the next text. Now this one, you would probably, there's a good chance you could see something like this on the SAT. It's not too hard of a read, but still challenging in some aspects. But we can critical read things that are not maybe obvious candidates for critical reading. So the example I'm going to give here for my fiction passage is an excerpt from Stephenie Meyer's Twilight. Now, if you're a fan of Twilight, I don't mean to insult the book by using it as an example of something the SAT wouldn't use. I think you would agree that, like I said, you're not going to see something like this on the SAT. You're going to see something more like Charles Dickens or some other more established writer. In any event, we can still critical read this because we can still pay close attention to the choices Meyer makes as she writes this passage, and maybe some of the types of SAT questions that could be asked about a fiction passage such as this. So let's go ahead and get started with this one. I've never read Twilight before. I've only read this excerpt. But let me give at least some of the background and context from what I understand is going on here. I think she's in a lunchroom, I believe. And Bella is the character, the narrator here, and she's new to this school, and she's kind of describing what she's seeing or the people she's seeing in this room. So here we go. I felt a surge of pity and relief. Pity because, as beautiful as they were outsiders, clearly not accepted. Relief that I wasn't the only newcomer here, and certainly not the most interesting by any standard. So we begin with an interesting point where there's a certain ambivalence to the emotions that Bella is feeling at this point. Let me just move this up just in case you can't see it. Right? She feels both pity and relief towards this group of people that she's observing. She pities them because she kind of understands their outsider nature, right? Because she is one herself. But then she also feels relief because she's not the only one. And in fact, she may be less outsidery than this group. So that's an interesting moment of ambivalence, maybe one that the SAT might pick up on. Next, as I examined them, the youngest, one of the Cullens, looked up and met my gaze, this time with evident curiosity in his expression. So we might think a vocab and context question could be what evident means in this context. As I looked swiftly away, it seemed to me that his glance held some kind of unmet expectation. So I'll return to this, because this seems to be a theme or some kind of current running under this part of the passage. We'll come back to that. Which one is the boy with the reddish-brown hair, I asked. I peeked at him from the corner of my eye, and he was still staring at me, but not gawking like the other students had today. He had a slightly frustrated expression. I looked down again. So notice, again, we have this idea that Edward is frustrated with his expression. He's trying to communicate something. And this, again, connects back to this part where his glance held some kind of unmet expectation. He was frustrated for whatever reason. And clearly we're going to learn something about this later. But the SAT maybe might pick up on a connection between those two lines or something. So just an interesting note. So note what Meyer is trying to do here, have some kind of communication between the two characters, even though they, number one, haven't met yet, or at least we think they haven't met, or we think that there's no connection between them, and also communicate something non-verbally through glances, and whatever those glances might mean. Moving on. That's Edward. He's gorgeous, of course, but don't waste your time. He doesn't date. Apparently none of the girls here are good-looking enough for him. She sniffed a clear case of sour grapes. I wondered when he turned her down. So maybe one thing the SAT could ask is what this sour grapes means in context, right? What does it suggest about this particular character? What does it suggest about Edward? Those kinds of things. Moving on. I bit my lip to hide my smile. Then I glanced at him again. His face was turned away, but I thought his cheek appeared lifted as if he were smiling too. So again, we get this idea that there's something else going on between these two characters who have not met yet, that there's going to be some kind of connection to them, that if it isn't already established, that certainly will be established at a later time. Last paragraph. After a few more minutes, the four of them left the table together. They were all noticeably graceful, even the big brawny one. It was unsettling to watch. The one named Edward didn't look at me again. So this line in particular, I think, is interesting in how it reinforces and contributes to the mood of the passage. And I think the mood of the passage can probably be best described as enigmatic, or mysterious. Right? This interaction between Edward and Bella, when they first quasi-meet, you can say, or notice each other at least, there's a lot of weird things going on, weird undercurrents, and especially we see this contrast between gracefulness and brawniness, and the surprising aspect of that, and that it was unsettling, I think adds to this mood of the passage. And I think it just combines thematically with what's going on through this part of the story, where Bella's an outsider. She already feels in a strange position, and then is now put into this new situation with this person that she hasn't met, and already establishing some kind of connection with yet another outsider. So anyway, we can again perhaps talk more about this passage in some depth, and there will probably be a ton of questions the SAT could ask about it. But even with a passage such as this, which frankly, I mean, I'm not saying it's bad writing, but it's just, there's not much we can do with it, right? There's not as much depth to it as, say, maybe something you would read in English. But nonetheless, we can still ask a bunch of questions about it and try to figure out why Meyer made the choices she did. Anyway, let's move on now to a discussion of one of the bad habits that we all have when it comes to reading, and how we need to fix that bad habit before we do better on the SAT critical reading section.